After an interesting free practice this morning, bear in mind there's only one free practice this weekend, it is a sprint weekend, in which, yes, Mercedes were 1-2, but Kimi Antonelli quicker than George Russell on a George circuit, Lewis Hamilton quicker than Charles Leclerc in the Ferraris, the McLarens trying out all their new bits, not quite there, Red Bull looking very impressive with Max a second a lap quicker than anyone on his first runs, and then being the only driver to go out and do a solid fuel run later in that free practice session, 13 laps, all very consistent laps, apart from an off in the middle, slight off anyway. After all that, then sprint qualifying in a way was a bit of an anticlimax because everybody filed into order. 2 Mercedes, followed by the 2 McLarens, followed by the 2 Ferraris, followed by the 2 Red Bulls. Interesting intra-team battles. George Russell asserting himself over Kimi Antonelli. Kimi very quick though, just behind him, but on the front row. So if this is a race where George Russell is really comfortable with the circuit and the upgrades on the Mercedes have worked, and they've obviously worked for George, then also they're looking good too for Kimi Antonelli. In terms of his championship lead and in terms of how this year may progress, Canada at this point, an indication that Kimi Antonelli, so far as George Russell is concerned, is not going to go away, even on a George Russell circuit. Really good from Kimi, I thought. Excellent lap from George. Good recovery lap after everything that's been going on in the last 3 races for him. So Mercedes on the front row. No real surprise there, but Mercedes, the best car in Canada, no doubt about that. McLaren, a bit of a scratchy morning, but eventually got it together. Lando in and out of the garage. Oscar had various moments. Lando had various moments as well. Lots of upgrades on the McLaren, but they got it to work. And right at the end, both of them just filtered into P3, P4. So we have the 2 Mercs, the 2 McLarens, and then the 2 Ferraris. Lewis Hamilton, one of the stories of the day, looked really good this morning, very good throughout qualifying for the sprint race, particularly on the medium tyres. Charles Leclerc nowhere near him on the medium tyres. When they got to the soft tyre, Charles had a bit more grip, looked a little bit more comfortable in the car. Charles absolutely on the limit, and Lewis never really, apart from when he was on cold tyres, Lewis never really looking ragged at any stage. Difficult to say that his corners are shorter now or whether they're still a little bit longer, because Canada's a sort of circuit with high-speed braking, with chicanes. It's not a circuit that rewards anything particularly interesting. It just rewards a good, fluent lap, and that's what Lewis Hamilton was doing all day. Full credit to him to out-qualify Charles. He'll have some satisfaction over that and some disappointment, I think, that after everything that happened in the morning and on the medium tyres, that the Ferrari wasn't quite there on the soft tyre. But then again, no real surprise there. What you can say is that Ferrari do appear to have the quickest car in a straight line aerodynamically, probably because they don't have the same aero efficiency as Mercedes and McLaren. So Ferrari have an advantage there, maybe, but in these days of the regulations and the electrification and the kilojoules, is that really going to be an advantage? We will see. Anyway, the forecasts are for some rain on Sunday. So when we go into qualifying on Saturday, it'll be interesting to see, as Mark Slade was suggesting, whether or not anybody runs more downforce. Maybe on this circuit they will, maybe not. We'll need to watch that closely. But certainly for today and the race tomorrow, predicted to be the sprint race, predicted to be dry. Everybody running Canadian Grand Prix setup. And then after the 2 Ferraris, the 2 Red Bulls. Max Verstappen, very impressive, I thought, actually, on the Friday morning. He was a second a lap quicker when the track was pretty dirty, second lap quicker than everybody else, and didn't really progress in terms of lap time, but that's because there were incidents, there were red flag incidents, the session had to be extended 15 minutes. And Max always looking good, the one and only runner to run fuel and do a proper 13-lap fuel run. So he does have some sort of feel for how the car will be in the race tomorrow. And equally, possibly his 1-lap speed today affected by not doing as much 1-lap setup running as his peers, as everybody around him. Very good job by Isaac Hadjar to come back after a couple of difficult weekends, let's put it that way. Came back and right there, exactly where he should be, just behind Max, and doing a very good job endorsing everything that Red Bull are doing. It's been a while since we've seen a Red Bull with both the drivers right up there, very close to one another, and reasonably competitive as well, although shouldn't get too excited because Max did two or three practice starts today, one from the pit lane, the others on the grid, and still very slow way initial take up. So we'll see what happens going into turn one tomorrow with that. And then two very good P9 and P10, two very good performances by two individual drivers, by Arvid Lindblad in the Racing Bulls, same power unit of course as the Red Bull factory team. Excellent performance. He's been quick from the beginning of practice, really impressive. Liam Lawson was actually, his teammate was actually quite good early on in the untimed session on Friday. Everybody was out on hard tyres. He was on mediums and was actually quite quick for a lap or two. Then he stopped out on the circuit, and the damage, presumably some sort of power unit drama, because they never had enough time to change the power unit, the whole transmission. These things are very complicated, so he had to sit out the rest of the morning session and sat out qualifying as well. And the other, and P10, Carlos Sainz thrashing around in the Williams Mercedes. Alex Albon had an off and didn't get out for qualifying, so not very impressive performance by him. But Carlos Sainz, fabulous to watch, spectacular, all over the place really, but getting the best from the car. Very good run strategy as well from Williams to get him into the top 10 as well. Fernando Alonso was also reasonably quick for the first time this year. He was out on mediums like Liam Lawson early on Friday when everybody else was on hards, but he was sort of midfield. And then he switched to softs quite early and went a little bit quicker. And when they were all out on softs, he was actually on mediums. So the Aston Martin looking a little bit better. No upgrades at all, just working on the power unit, the vibration and everything else going on the back of the car. But in sprint qualifying for Fernando, a classic Fernando thing in some ways, I guess. He was P14, which meant he was going to get through to Q2, SQ2 with a couple of minutes to go, and lost it under braking for the first chicane, got on the marbles on the left, locked up and just went straight on. Interestingly, kept his hands on the steering wheel as he went into the barrier, Tech Pro barrier, head on. Not, a bit disappointing given that how quick he was at that point, relatively quick. But of course, it still got him into Q2, and he will start 14th tomorrow. And that's something for Aston Martin, I suppose you could say, some step forward. Big upgrades on the Mercedes. They seem to be working well. Big upgrades on the McLaren, working well. Ferrari, no upgrades at all. Also working pretty well around Canada. And that's probably what they thought. This should be a circuit where they will go quite well. And they do have that top speed. So it'll be interesting to see if Lewis and Charles can do anything with that in terms of racecraft tomorrow. And Red Bull have got a few upgrades, not as many as McLaren and Mercedes, and making progress, kind of. As I say, impressive that they had that fuel run. They got the fuel run under the belt for Max, but still not quite there. Definitely not quite there, but making progress, you can say that. So anyway, we'll see what happens tomorrow in the sprint race, and qualifying, of course, as well tomorrow for the Grand Prix. Big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, to RAC Watchers, and to TrackNinja for their support of this channel, and of course to you, the viewer, for watching. See you then. Sprint race, I think, will be remembered in 26 as the first real occasion we've had sparks between George Russell and Kimi Antonelli. For sure will not be the last either. Both of them have championship winning cars. Both of them want to win the championship, and both of them unbelievably competitive. Well, let's rephrase that. We know how competitive George Russell is, but Kimi, we know, absolutely brilliant on slow corners, lovely soft touch, shorter corners than George Russell, always going to be quicker on places like the hairpin, or better, shall we say, in Montreal, maybe 1 and 2 as well in Montreal for Kimi. And very good now also, medium speed corners, change of direction, chicanes. There was one other area, well, fast corners too, very good. There's one other area we still hadn't really seen Kimi, and that was how aggressive is he? Well, we saw in the sprint race in Canada that he's incredibly aggressive as well. It all happened on the 7th lap of the sprint race. George Russell took off from the pole. There was a long delay, a lot of slow cars pulling up onto the grid. Long delay, but nonetheless, the Mercedes perfect off the line. George Russell made a great start, pulls off into the lead. But Kimi Antonelli right behind him, right in his mirrors, 0.5, 0.6, 0.3, 0.4, right there for the first 4 or 5 laps. And then probably George is, at this point, is starting to feel the balance is going away. We know later on in the race he had a problem with the left rear. It started to grain, as it did for many others. But George is always going to be harder on that left rear than Kimi. And Kimi now is all over George, and he's kind of, at one point going into the last chicane, he has to pull out of George's toe in order not to run into the back of him. He's braking later. He's getting into the corner earlier. He's just looking really, really good on the back of, in the mirrors of George. Not that George would have enjoyed it. And then going into turn 1, beginning of lap 7, George brakes a little bit earlier from the middle of the road. It's a left-hander, remember, followed immediately by a much slower, tighter right. It's a great bit of road. I've described it before, indeed, recently on the live stream. And Kimi does a reflex thing of suddenly then, oh, there's a bit of road here on the outside. I'll go to the outside, which I say reflex because I think if he thought about it, he would never have done that. If he thought about it in a sane, rational way. But he's a racing driver, and it's brilliant to see him doing these things. Reminds me a little bit of Nigel in his early Lotus days, when he was just surprised that Elio or Mario were not using bits of road that he was using, and suddenly there was something happening in front which enabled him just to go straight through. And they thought it was a pass. In fact, he was just sort of using a bit of road. Obviously, in Kimi's case, it was a pass, and he did have the grip, and everything was there. But then George came across as inevitably he would, going into the tight right, turn 2. So Kimi did the right thing. He moved to the right and then obviously made sure he didn't T-bone George going across the boonies to the outside of turn 2 and rejoined. And it was a great moment, I thought. It was a great moment for Formula One to see that we're going to have some racing between these two. Great moment to see how aggressive Kimi is and how quick he is on George's circuit. And it's a sprint race, remember. So, and he's leading the championship. Every reason for him to back off and let the team leader take this easily, but he didn't. He just went for it. Now, having said that, I think he then made a big mistake because, well, let me just finish what happened on track, because then on the same lap, George is now a bit slower and circumspect and wondering what's going on. And as they go into the last chicane before the hairpin, George is sort of left of centre, brakes early again. Kimi just goes to the right. Obviously, the adrenaline's up now, big time. But he's on now an area where nobody ever goes. He's on the marbles. He hits the brakes and locks up and basically goes straight on. Again, has a straight line of chicane and rejoins. And now, in lacking momentum on acceleration out of there, Lando Norris gets him, and that's how the race finishes, even though Kimi is still pretty quick, even after all that stuff, and he must have done some floor damage. But anyway, getting back to the point, Kimi then makes a mistake because he actually then calls for a penalty for George Russell for forcing him off and saying I was alongside him. And I think that was a big mistake. You know how Toto is going to react to that. And he's never going to want his young guy, no matter how fond he is of him, to start saying, I want a penalty for George Russell. And so Toto then gets on the radio, says, stop moaning, Kimi, just concentrate on beating Lando. In terms of radio communication and the public face, he should have stayed dead quiet, dead cool, and just remained. And the way Bernie Ecclestone always used to say, keep your powder dry and take it out in qualifying, take the adrenaline into qualifying. And then the race tomorrow. As it is, I suspect as I speak, Kimi's probably been called into Toto's office in the motorhome. And probably Toto is saying, I don't want any more of that. It nearly cost one of our cars in that race. Take it easy. It's a long season ahead. Don't ever start talking for a penalty for our other driver. It's not appropriate. And he'll go in. I hope this doesn't happen, but I suspect he'll probably go into qualifying with his tail between his legs a bit. And I hope it doesn't happen, as I say. So that was a learning experience, you can say, particularly as the inevitable point needs to be made. Had he just stayed behind George, he could well have won that race because he might well have had his tyres in better shape towards the end, but of course we'll never know. Great for the fans, great for the viewers, they can all talk about it, but from Kimi's point of view, I think it was a mistake to do that, and so that's how they finished in that order. But Kimi did set fastest lap as well. I mean, just a great drive from both of them. George Russell drove beautifully as well, nursing that left rear, and Lando got pretty near him. Lando drove very well, actually, and put George under a lot of pressure, but classic Lando Miami situation, didn't do anything with, when he was with Kimi, didn't actually really make an aggressive pass on George, and George could just sit there. No, what's any Lando? He's not going to do anything unless I make a mistake, and I'm not going to make a mistake, and disappeared. Well, he didn't disappear, but he won the race. So yeah, Lando second, Kimi third. Lewis should have been fourth in the Ferrari, drove really well throughout. Nice pass as they off the line. They go into one, and Lewis goes round the outside of Piastri at turn 2. And if you get far enough ahead on acceleration, there's enough grip there on the outside, you can then hold that on that little acceleration run down to the chicane. And he did that. So Oscar then had to filter in behind Lewis. And that was really how that race was. It was Lewis, Oscar, Charles Leclerc, with Oscar unable to do anything about Lewis Hamilton in the Ferrari, which is a bit pathetic, really. You'd imagine, given how good the McLaren is, and we saw how good it is with Lando, I was really surprised how poorly Oscar drove that race and how he couldn't get past Lewis and get up there with the leaders. Anyway, be that as it may, Lewis drove really well, but then his tyres went off right at the end, and he hit the wall quite hard coming out of the last corner with 2 laps to go. They said on the radio, no, the car's fine. But then on the next lap, Lewis, at the end of the straight coming into that chicane, locks up because the rears have gone off, I guess, and he's playing around with the brake balance, and he goes straight on. And obviously then at that point, Oscar gets past him, and so does Charles Leclerc. So it was a shame for him. Lewis, the result will not equal his performance in that race. But then again, in order to be out there in front of Oscar, I guess you could say he's had to use his tyres to the limit. So it was a very good drive by Lewis in that respect. But he'll be gutted by that because he needs a result out there in front of Charles. And Charles got the result in the end ahead of Lewis. Anyway, a very good sprint race in that sense. It showed us those things. And it also showed us, just to repeat the point, that even though it's a sprint race, and even though he's got a nice situation, nice momentum, Kimi Antonelli used it to be very aggressive against his teammate, George Russell. Bring it on. I just hope he keeps the fire burning now going into qualifying. Well, the final lineup for the Canadian Grand Prix after qualifying, pretty similar to yesterday. 2 Mercedes on the front row, 2 McLarens on the second row. Big difference, though, the 2 Ferraris. Lewis Hamilton's still quicker of the 2 Ferrari drivers, but the 2 Ferraris split by the 2 Red Bull drivers. So Charles Leclerc still struggling in the other Ferrari. But let's get to the pole. It was George Russell following on from his very, very good win in the sprint race today. Excellent concentration under pressure from first Kimi Antonelli, his teammate, and then Lando Norris. They finished in the order George, Lando, Kimi, and there's a separate video about that out already. But George on the pole, very good lap. He didn't get a time in on his first run in Q3. He did admit afterwards that Mercedes do have a setup change, bearing in mind it's likely to be wet tomorrow for the Canadian Grand Prix, to have wet patches anyway, which would suggest they're running more rear downforce, and didn't feel the back of the car in harmony with the front on the first run, but went out and put in an excellent lap just to beat Kimi Antonelli, who'd been super quick on his second run as well. Where was the difference? Sector 2. Kimi quicker in sectors 1 and 3, which says a lot about Kimi Antonelli's maturity, doesn't it? But sector 2, George was slightly quicker, just enough to get the pole. And it was going into the first part of sector 2, because as they come out of that first chicane, Kimi Antonelli was about 1 kilometre, 2 kilometres an hour quicker than George on that sort of right-hand kink as they approached the second chicane. A little bit quicker than George. And then because of that, it seems as if he braked fraction early because he was carrying more speed, whereas George braked later there. He's a little bit down on speed, braked later, and actually carried more speed into the second chicane. Call it Kimi being a little bit conservative, I think, on the lap, but getting the car there and qualifying second, an excellent second. But George using his experience there to get the pole just by braking a tad later in what amounts to 120, 123 kilometre per hour chicane. So a slowish corner, but not of the type that you find at Monaco, for example. This was high-speed braking into that slow corner. So, yeah, not unsurprising that George would still have a slight edge, at least in one of those areas around the Montreal lap. Because, as I say, going into the hairpin, Kimi Antonelli absolutely superb. And also at the end of the main straight, at the end of the lap, Kimi brilliant there as well. So Mercedes 1-2 with a setup for the wet tomorrow. Looks like it's a bit of a compromise, sounds like it's a bit of a compromise, that if it is dry, in the sense that they have to go out in the safety car and they don't start the race until it's relatively dry, then Mercedes might still have an advantage. It won't be like Max at Spa probably, but interesting to see that they do that and that they still they think there's an advantage to run more downforce in the wet. P3, P4, Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri. I gave Oscar a bit of a hard time in the sprint video for not really doing more from where he was with a car that good, but absolutely on the knuckle with Lando around Canada. In the context of this being Oscar's year, Lando won the championship last year. Oscar needs to really step up and dominate the team and do well this year. It hasn't been a great weekend for Oscar so far, but at least he is there with Lando in terms of time, and the difference between them absolutely minuscule. So Oscar Piastri in pretty good shape to get a result tomorrow, but still having to give a little bit to Lando Norris, and Lando of course drove beautifully in the sprint race today as well. But McLaren looking good. They've had those upgrades. They're looking strong. Looks as if they're running a full dry setup on that car, but we'll see tomorrow. That's based on the comments Lando made after the race. And then comes Lewis Hamilton in the Ferrari, who had some moments, had some lockups, went straight on, very near the wall, but continuing to upstage Charles Leclerc, as he has done from the start of this weekend. So in that sense, and it is a personal thing for Lewis against Charles, in that sense, a very, very strong performance by Lewis. Unfortunate that he did lose those positions right at the end of the sprint race. So obviously he'll be working very hard to make sure that doesn't happen in the race tomorrow. So very good performance. Max Verstappen and Isaac Hadjar splitting the two Ferraris, as I say. Isaac actually quickest in Q2 today, did a 12.9. He repeated that right at the end of Q3. And Max Verstappen not happy at all. It seems on the rate, it's quite difficult to understand exactly what he was saying, but what I think he's complaining about is his top speed being down on Isaac Hadjar. So let's have a look and see what that was. On the lap that he did his quickest time, slightly quicker than Isaac. Max's speed, highest speed on the straight was 3.27 and Isaac Hadjar was 3.30. So 3 kilometers an hour, that would be enough to annoy Max Verstappen. Bearing in mind, if you look at something like the exit of turn 9, which is the last chicane before the hairpin, quite a quick chicane that one, and how they come out of there is representative of not only how well the car is balanced and how much grip it has, but also how well they're harvesting the power and what power they can use out of there. Max out of there 180 kilometers an hour, Isaac Hadjar 176. So 4 kilometers an hour quicker than Isaac at that point, exit of turn 9, and yet on the straight Max is 3 kilometers an hour slower than Isaac Hadjar. So you can see where he's getting wound up and what's going on there. This is all to do with harvesting and what strats they run throughout the lap, and they have to try to change the strat just before the braking point going into the last corner. All these new things, a function of these 2026 regs. The drivers are spending most of their time, well, at least half the time probably, faffing around on the steering wheel, making sure they're in exactly the right strat at exactly the right moment. I was listening actually in Q2 to Josh Reckett, Pierre Gasly's race engineer, to see what was going on with Pierre in Q1. He didn't get out of Q2, but in Q1 he ran over some debris just as he was about to start his quickest lap. So he was lucky to get into Q2, but he was nowhere in Q2. And it was all about, look, Pierre, if you can do it, see if you can change the strat just before the braking area. You may not be able to, but that'll help a little bit with the power harvesting. All this stuff, you know, it's not what racing drivers should have to be worrying about. And I get the feeling that in the case of Pierre Gasly, it's really cramping his style as a fluid, flary racing driver. Whereas Franco Colapinto, credit to him, into Q3 again, doing a very good job, systematic type job, getting the best from the car all the time. Anyway, I digress because we were talking about Max and how irate he was about his top speed. And you can see why, because the racing driver part of the lap, he's doing the job. 3 kilometers an hour quicker on an exit of a medium speed chicane, quicker than his teammate, who's very fast anyway. And then he's 3 kilometers an hour slower on the straight. So that's what that was all about. Still trying to get it right at Red Bull powertrain Ford, quite obviously. And Charles Leclerc, listen to Charles just before Q3, and he was saying, all I want is a clear lap. All I want is a clear lap. Clear air, actually, he said. And he did get a clear air, but he wasn't as quick as Lewis. And I think another factor today in qualifying was that the temperatures were way down, about 10 degrees centigrade colder track temperature today. and a lot of the drivers complaining about the fronts not coming in. I think that was also a factor between Max and Isaac. It's one of these black art mystery things about how some drivers can get the tyres to work when the temperatures are cold, others can't. And there is a scientific path you can take towards that, but it's not bulletproof, that is for sure. So Isaac Hadjar qualified 7th, Charles Leclerc 8th. He won't be happy about that at all. And in terms of the 3, in inverted commas, rookies who made it through to Q3, Isaac Hadjar on this occasion the quicker of the 3, followed by Arvid Lindblad, who again did an outstanding job in the Racing Bulls, and the aforementioned Franco Colapinto in the Alpine. So there we are. I said in the video about the sprint race that I think the only mistake that Kimi Antonelli made in the sprint was to get on the radio and start complaining about George. Of course, it's going to be different tomorrow. It's a full-length Grand Prix for a start. Secondly, the weather's going to play a part for sure. So it's unlikely, probably we'll get the same wheel-on-wheel, eyeball-to-eyeball stuff that we had in the sprint race today. But Kimi has shown, as I said in the other video, Kimi has shown that he is unafraid to be aggressive as well with his teammate. He wants to win, and he can sniff a lot more happening this year as well. George, though, supreme around Montreal. 2 excellent days for him. On the pole for the sprint, won the sprint, and now on the pole for the Grand Prix. Long way to go until we get to the end of the race tomorrow. And don't forget, for members, we are going to be doing live chat of the Canadian Grand Prix, starting about half an hour before the start, going right through to the checkered flag. It's going to be a lot of fun. If you haven't joined yet as a member, you can do so by clicking the join tab below our videos. Love to have you on board. And if you've joined already, thanks for doing so, and looking forward to having some fun with you tomorrow. Big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, to TrackNinja, and to REC Watches for their support of this channel. See you on Sunday. What a Canadian Grand Prix. They've been forecasting showers and rain all weekend from Friday onwards, but in reality it didn't rain. It was a little bit damp as they left the garages. A lot of the cars went out on intermediates, but most, as we saw when the covers came off on the grid, switched to softs, mainly to softs at the front end of the grid, or maybe to mediums if you wanted to take a bit of a gamble with a longer first stint. Dry tyres anyway, except for McLaren, who stayed on intermediates. They had, they thought, an inside track on the weather, that it was going to rain. The problem is, of course, there are always delays, and there was a delay in Canada, a very unforeseen delay, because as they pulled up for the start proper after the formation lap, they stood forever on the grid, maximum revs, waiting for the lights to go out. And eventually Kimi went forward, and you thought, oh, is he going to get penalised? But then the start was aborted. And they did 2 additional laps after that. There was obviously some problem with the starting light system. It did work okay after that. But by this time, with Lando and Oscar on the radio saying, are we sure we're on the right tyres here? McLaren was saying, well, it does look as if it's going to clear, but you're going to have good tyre temperature for the first couple of laps, so make good use of it. As if that was some compensation. And sure enough, Lando did lead from the second row, got the lead into turn 1 on his intermediates, did 2 laps, and then came in and obviously had to switch to medium tyres. Oscar the same. And indeed, Lando didn't finish the race. So even if he had started on the right tyres, and even if he'd made a brilliant start and led the race, he still wouldn't have finished. He had a power unit problem, like George Russell, but we'll get onto that in a second. Oscar Piastri did battle through to the finish, with emphasis on the word battle, hitting other cars and generally having penalties and all sorts of things going on in the garage. So not a good day for McLaren. But of course that meant that all of a sudden it was the Mercedes, and then it was a big battle between the Ferraris and potentially the Red Bulls, Max Verstappen and Isaac Hadjar. Anyway, we now had a motor race at the front, because with Lando going down the inside on those intermediates, George braked incredibly early into one, and Kimi just zapped him into one and was in front of George. So the millisecond that Lando was out of the race, effectively, Kimi Antonelli was in the lead. He led the first 5 laps of the Canadian Grand Prix. Then George passed him, and you thought, right, well, this is going to be a sort of Mercedes situation. But Kimi stayed right with him. He was right there, and he was never away from George's mirrors. He led again from laps 22 to 24, according to the lap chart, but there were plenty of passes during the lap as well, particularly going into 10, the hairpin. It was just constant racing, and for George Russell, it was nothing but pressure. He didn't need this. This was his Grand Prix in theory, and he was Kimi Antonelli just all over him. So whatever was said to Kimi and maybe to George after the sprint race either went through one ear and out the other, or dare I say it wasn't said at all, because Kimi was just all over George everywhere, driving beautifully, shorter corners, softer inputs. Everything he was doing to the car meant also that he wasn't ruining his tyres, even though he was sitting right behind George, which normally damages the tyres more than the leaders. And George was driving well, driving just like George Russell, but you could see slightly wider turn in, a little bit spikier everywhere with the steering inputs, not necessarily the footwork, but the steering inputs certainly. And Kimi just all over him. And a couple of times he passed him, then George repassed him, mainly on the straight, but also running wide at the hairpin as well, both of them. Until eventually the word came out from the Mercedes garage, something along the lines of, this racing is too close. If you're going to continue like this, we're going to have to stop it. Quite what that meant, I don't know. But anyway, there was also a moment when both of them were under investigation for illegal passes. And one wondered what was going to happen there. They both had to give the position back to one another. Anyway, Kimi was all over George. And whenever George got in front, it looked as if he might get a slower car between him and Kimi and pull away. But not, Kimi would always close the gap and be there. And they would occasionally run wide, as I say, and have these issues. And he wondered what was going to happen. Presumably the pit stop for medium tyres was going to sort it all out. But they never made it to the pit stop. On his 31st lap, George Russell was leading Kimi by under a second, the normal thing. Suddenly, as he hit the brakes, the engine just died. Turns out the battery just ran out of power. I guess a function, you could say, of the 2026 regulations. And he went straight on over the grass runoff area, pulled to a halt just as he got back on the track again. Furious, as he would be, chucked the headrest out, as he would. I mean, it just absolutely gutting for George to have won the sprint race, got the 2 poles, and now leading Kimi. Incredible race between the two of them. I mean, right up there with anything you'd ever see. Mansell, Piquet, Senna, Prost, Fangio, Moss. This was really good stuff. And he was out of it with an engine problem. And thereafter, Kimi just sailed through to win his 4th Grand Prix. Almost forgotten, because all the TV then focused on the next battle, which was Lewis Hamilton catching Max Verstappen. Max was now second. They're on medium tyres. The Red Bull not as good on the mediums as it had been on the soft, probably because the soft, with its additional grip, glues over some of the issues that that car has in terms of grip and balance. But with the mediums, it was exposed, and Max was absolutely brilliant in his defence. No mistakes at all. He did lock up once Lewis had got past him, but with pressure from Lewis on the mediums and Lewis catching him 2 or 3 tenths a lap, Max was absolutely brilliant. It took Lewis a long time to get him, but eventually got him when Max had a rather strange moment coming out of the last corner. And it appears as if he sort of lost power on the pit straight. Lewis got alongside him and then got him on the outside going into one. Very nice pass by Lewis. And even then, Max didn't give up. He was right behind Lewis for too long, then eventually had that lock up and settled for 3rd place. So Lewis Hamilton, in a battle with Max Verstappen, finally, for the first time probably since Abu Dhabi 21, eventually beat Max and got that place on the podium. And I don't think there was anybody happier probably in North American continent, let alone in Canada, than Lewis Hamilton after that race. Just the smile as big as you could possibly have. His mum was there. And because not only had he been second, and a very good second, beating Max Verstappen, but Charles Leclerc had been nowhere. Max thrashed Charles Leclerc, who finished P4 in the other Ferrari. Not in contention all weekend. Lewis upstaged him all weekend. I've absolutely no idea what happened to Charles Leclerc. I've never seen him have a weekend like that before. And even towards the second half of the race, when you would imagine on mediums, Charles normally in that situation suddenly gets into a groove and finds something in the car that he can do with it. Even then, Lewis was still lapping 2-3 tenths quicker than Charles for the entire Grand Prix distance. So Charles, a very distant 4th, magnified by a lurid half spin. Actually quite a nice catch coming out of the last corner towards the end of the race as well. Isaac Hadjar fifth. Good result for him. Good result for him. A, from a Red Bull Max Verstappen context, doing a good job for the team. And B, despite having various penalties and moments with traffic and all sorts of things going on. So he nonetheless still finished P5 ahead of Franco Colapinto. Did an excellent job in P6. That's 2 races in a row where Colapinto's looked outstandingly good in the Alpine Mercedes. Pierre Gasly a little bit better, but not as quick as Franco over the race distance. And Liam Lawson was a good 7th after starting P12 on the grid, and obviously had 0 running, or very little running, on Friday as well. So it's difficult to know what the actual race highlight was. Was it McLaren's underwhelming choice to start on intermediate tyres, Kimi's chase of George Russell and the race he took to George Russell on a George Russell circuit, George's sudden retirement, and then once they were racing for second place, Sir Lewis Hamilton rolling back the years and finishing second after a big battle with Max Verstappen. Wonderful to see Lewis on the podium, and what a fillip for Ferrari as well. Who would have thought that he'd blow Charles Leclerc away like this around Montreal? But Lewis Hamilton, one of the stars of the race, absolutely no doubt about that. Max, absolutely brilliant in defence. And the new regs kind of taking second place to everything that was going on, although the Ferraris quicker than the Red Bull on the straight, but not really able to do a proper pass. Lewis always saying he needed more power, even though aerodynamically he was quicker on the straight. And Max on the mediums, not being able to do very much with the car, probably because of the harvesting and the deployment and everything that comes with the 26 regs. Maybe with a different power unit, with a 20-25 power unit, he would have been able to do more with that car. But it was what it was. And Max Verstappen was on the podium for Red Bull, which was an incredible achievement, really, when you think of where they're coming from. What a race. A very, very good Canadian Grand Prix. And so we go forward now to Monaco, 2 weeks' time for Monaco, where Kimi Antonelli, for sure, will not be slow on those, all around all those. Those corners almost built for Kimi's driving style. So George needs to regroup again. Yes, it was a pretty good weekend for him in terms of restoring his confidence, the 2 poles, the sprint win, leading the race. But the amount of pressure that Kimi put him under on the George circuit was will not go away. And that means a lot, I think, coming back into the European part of the tour this year. And for Charles Leclerc, the Monegasque, his circuit, his home circuit, he now needs to dig deep and think about what happened in Canada. Or maybe not. Maybe probably best for him not to think about what happened in Canada and just to think, well, Monaco's next. I'll be okay, and just let it happen. That's probably the best thing for Charles to do. But there will be a lot of question marks. There'll be a lot of chat going on about Charles and what happened there in Canada this weekend. And I'm sure he doesn't know, because if he did know, it wouldn't have happened. So lots of question marks, lots of unanswerables, but nothing will detract from this being an outstanding Canadian Grand Prix. Big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, to TrackNinja and to REC Watches for their support of this channel. And don't forget, we'll be back with a live stream this Wednesday. I'll be doing a cam chat tomorrow when the dust has settled a little bit. Lots to talk about. Looking forward to that. And yeah, roll on the Monaco Grand Prix. Starting to look good this 2026 Formula One season. Take care.